Hello everyone, in this video I create a hand-painted texture for this model. I've been optimizing this model. It used to be 3,800 polygons and it's now a little over 370 polygons, so I reduced it to about 10% of its original poly count. What you see here is a ambient occlusion pass that I rendered out in 3ds Max, and I used to have a different set of UVW coordinates that I had done previously on the previous stream automatically, and I don't really like how those come out because it's the software deciding where it's going to put all the UVW clusters. So what I did was I sort of grouped everything together with materials. So whatever is wood is close together, and that means that if there's some bleeding effect from the texture, so all of this is wood, all these pieces are wood. So if there's any bleeding effect from the texture being shrunken by mip-mapping, then it'll probably bleed to a similar color. So I decided to go with wood and cast iron, so really dark iron. And because I've already have the ambient occlusion pass, it's actually quite easy to locate the different shapes of the model. So I already automatically know where my surfaces are going to be, and here I'm just painting a texture, a wood texture on the sort of the arms. They're going to shoot like slime balls off, and so because I know where the shadows are, because the ambient occlusion calculated that, I'm super comfortable finding where the bright spots are as well. And just by adding that detail there, it actually becomes quite interesting in terms of shading. It has that volume just because even though it's monochromatic, it already provides that information of metal. The issue here with this piece of metal that I've added, not only is it the different color from the other metal on the body, but also it was too thick. It looked too thick, so because there's no detail on the mesh, it looks to be poking out a lot. And this is the leg, the top of just above the foot, not the thigh. And I'm using the same kind of texture pattern, the same kind of stroking, except I'm not adding a board at each edge of the original mesh, because then it would be very tiny boards. This is the foot, and the feet are symmetrical. Actually, most of the texture is symmetrical. There's very little places where it isn't, so the barrel on the back of the robot is the only part, whereas there's hardly any symmetry. This is the top of the arm, and I'm lighting it similarly. I want the light to come up to that surface and kind of be brighter, so that in a way it looks like the light source is above, which for the most part is what usually happens. So here for the barrel at the front, this was just me. That heart I drew was just me showing people on the stream that this was a mirrored surface. Here I'm testing out the direction of the wood boards, and at the back of the model, it's so off that I actually have to go in and add a couple of edges to the model to sort of support that deformation, because it's really, really excessive. And here the problem is that I have a big surface at the front of the robot, which is going to be really visible. And if I do any sort of really distinct shape, you're going to see that it's mirrored, but you're going to tell right away that it's mirrored. And that is something that kind of doesn't play with what I wanted. I want it to be very subdued, very neutral. So instead of having the detail at the front, I then use the wood grain and the knots in the wood. I make those on the sides so that you are less likely to see the repetition on the texture. And that's just to avoid the obvious fact that it's mirrored. So here's the side. I'm trying not to do a lot of wood texture underneath what is the shoulder guard, because then you would have a cast shadow. So I'm trying to keep that away from adding too much texture. But all of the top of the robot is actually quite well lit, so it should be fairly bright. This is the original model where this came from. It's something I had made years ago for a project that didn't really take off at all. So I thought it'd be interesting to save that model, and the animation that you just saw. That animation was also already made. So I actually thought of adding that to this game. So here I'm adding the extra edges, and I'm actually turning the edge to make sure that it's round enough for you to see. The video is fairly sped up. It's about 1,000% speed. So it's 10 times faster than it was initially. And so that's why everything is happening so quick. But here I'm starting to add details to the metal pieces. And the problem with the metal pieces is that I want to keep them dark. But if I keep them too dark, then there won't really be any volume in them. So you have to do highlights. But if you do highlights on a static lighting object, in this case this model is static, so there's really no dynamic lighting happening, it's not going to look like highlights. So I have to use worn edges, which is again very popular, very common, but it always feels like it's a very sort of cheap way to do it. And it always feels like you're just really going over the edges of the wireframe of the model. And there's a little more to it than that. But so here I start with a slime that I was planning on doing very green, but then kind of felt like green was a positive. And this is more towards the sort of the sick yellow, like a yellow like mustard, but not mustard. I eventually returned to a mix of this yellow and the green that I was using initially. But for this purpose, it kind of works because it translates into a sort of gooey slime that is pouring out of the edges of the boards, so of the spaces and the gaps in between the boards. This is the side protection on the top of the robot, and it's multiple planks of wood put together. And I'm not going too thinly on the details. This is a small texture file, but I will make it even smaller when I export it to the video game because it's a very small screen and it's a very small model on the screen. So it's actually, I don't really need to worry too much about it being visible or not. This is the seat where the goblin is going to sit, and that seat is going to be like leather, but I'm still figuring out what I want to do. So here I'm just adding the worn edges, and I'm trying some different textures on the sides of the structures just so that they have some detail to look at. And actually I end up doing just really basic layering. And layering is cool because it kind of makes some sense, but at the same time, it doesn't really need a lot of explanation. You don't overthink it when you look at that. You're just, oh, it's just a couple of, planks of metal welded on top of each other or stacked together or something. Also, these scratches that I add, they kind of look cool, but they will be super, super, super small in the final product. Plus, that part of the model actually gets slightly covered by the rest of the mesh. So here I'm doing the same with the barrel. I'm coming back to the wood texture, and I'm sort of cheating my way into speed by copying and pasting the wood texture. But I also have to figure out where the top is, and that's why I use that X, circle, and triangle. It's almost like I'm doing the PlayStation symbols. But the reason for that is once I do those, I can kind of locate those polygons on the mesh. And by doing that, I can decide which edges I want to make brighter. So for example, here on the metal rims, the metal's color is brighter at a certain point, and that point means the surfaces that are facing up. With that arrow as well, I was trying to determine where the rotation of that surface was. And this is just the side of the barrel, and it's the only part of the barrel that is actually mirrored. So both sides use this space of the texture. But as long as it looks good, as long as it makes sense, I don't really have to worry too much. This is just like the control gears at the front. And this is the part where they're going to be poking out from. And I'm really just painting in a few lines to kind of do that. There's multiple parts during the stream where I stop to explain stuff or that I describe something in more detail. And a lot of it is so fast that you probably miss it. But most of the work now is figuring out if a certain shadow or a certain highlight makes sense in the overall shading of the model. So if you go in and add worn edges, will you do something that is a little too extreme? It almost looks like a different color. And if you add a shadow, can you make sure that that shadow is always going to be there, or should that shadow move? Like for example, if you make a cast shadow, that cast shadow has to be to an object that is attached to that same object. So here for the leather, I use a technique that I usually do when I'm painting models in black and white. But in this case, I already had the color underneath, so it's not really that much of a difficult stretch. So what you start to do is you start to draw the thick and dark parts of the folds. And once you have that laid out, the dark parts of the folds, you can go in and actually determine where the highlights would hit. And once you have those highlights, you go in and add those of the brighter color. And by doing that, you're gradually building up the shape. But ideally, you want to start with large strokes of color, and then as you need to define more and more shape, you bring down the size of your brush. Here I'm adding a biped rig to the robot, and it's a very grotesque sort of skeleton, but it goes with the proportions. Because this is a rigid model, it's a robot, I can get away with rigid skinning. So all the vertices are 100% attached to a specific bone. Not all of them to the same, but whatever vertex it is, it's only responding to one bone. The only exception is here at the hip, where if you rotate the torso, you actually break the hip of the model. So to solve that, I actually have the top vertices of the hip attached to the torso bone, and then the bottom vertices of the hip attached to the hip bone. That way you keep the connection between the torso and the hip, but you actually don't ruin the connection at the bottom, where you can kind of see the gear parts. So this is how small it's going to be on the screen. It's going to be really tiny, and this is going to be the pilot. Now for the pilot, I did a little neat trick, which was I didn't create a second skeleton. I just skinned the head and body of the goblin to the head model of my biped, but the hands are attached to the torso so that the hands stay in place. And this is the final result of the two characters actually animating together. This is real time, this bit, and basically the goblin gets sort of thrown around by the weight of the robot. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoy this and that you learned something from it. Take care.